Content presented on the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent views of the Whole Care Network. Always consult your physician for medical and fitness advice, and always consult your attorney for legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hello and welcome to Daughterhood, the podcast. I am your host, Roseanne Corcoran, Daughterhood Circle Leader and Primary Caregiver. Daughterhood is the creation of Ann Tumlinson, who has worked on the front lines in the healthcare field for many years and has seen the multitude of challenges caregivers face. Our mission is to support and build confidence in women who are managing their parents' care. Daughterhood is what happens when we put our lives on hold to take care of our parents. We recognize this care is too much for one person to handle alone. We want to help you see your efforts are not only good enough, they are actually heroic. Our podcast goal is to bring you some insight into navigating the healthcare system, provide resources for you as a caregiver, as well as for you as a person, and help you know that you don't have to endure this on your own. Join me in Daughterhood. Barry Jacobs is a clinical psychologist, medical educator, and writer fostering the well-being of families coping with serious and chronic medical illnesses. Barry is the author of The Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers and has co-authored with his wife, Julia L. Mayer, AARP Meditations for Caregivers and AARP Love and Meaning After 50. Since 2013, he has been a blogger on family caregiving and relationships for AARP.org. In today's podcast, Barry and I discuss the challenges of caregiving with siblings. He offers strategies on dealing with those who don't or won't help, the micromanagers, how past family dynamics play a part in the sibling friction, animosity, and how to continue on after caregiving ends. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Barry, you have written some of the most insightful articles about sibling relationships and caregiving. Can you shed some light on what it is about this specific dynamic that causes so much stress?
I think, Roseanne, because people feel close to their siblings, they have a lot of they go way back with their siblings, right? There's been rivalries over the years. There often is a strong bond among siblings. And when a parent in common is ill, and there's the expectation that everybody is going to step up and pitch in, and there may be even be the belief that they're going to pitch in equally. But in reality, that's not what happens. Not everybody steps up, and even when everyone does, it's certainly not equal. It's extremely unusual for it to be equal. And people have feelings about that. Everybody remembers who was there in mom's hour of need and who wasn't. And that has a permanent impact on sibling relationships. And there are lots of dynamics as to who steps up and why they step up and who doesn't step up. But, there's what I find in my work as a counselor for family caregivers is that this is the one issue that gets people most upset.
Yeah.
Having a sibling who they feel has let them down.
Yes. And the dynamics that happen in that, not just in birth order, because, I was the youngest. I was the primary caregiver. Normally, you hear the oldest is a family caregiver. But then you get, well, you were the favorite, so you should be there. Or you're the closest, so you should have the responsibility, or whatever. There's those excuses that come up. And when you're in the midst of caregiving and you're struggling, it's almost like you want to say, can we just put all of this aside and get on the same page? But those family dynamics continue. And that is a big precursor of all of this stress. How do we deal with that?
So you said a very important phrase just now, Roseanne, and that is get everybody on the same page. And that's extremely difficult. I mean, you may have siblings who never have been on the same page about anything, right? They may end up on the same page about their favorite ice cream flavor, right?
Right.
But when it comes to a parent, they all really need to pull in the same direction. And so what often happens is, particularly early in a parent's illness, say the parent is developing dementia, siblings have very different opinions as to what's going on with the parent. There may be, if you have four siblings, if there are four
children
within the sibling group, then two of them may say, mom is really failing. We think she needs to be evaluated for dementia. Then the other two almost inevitably say, no, you're picking on mom. You're trying to take over her life. Leave mom alone.
Yep.
And so we get everybody on the same page about what mom's condition is, what mom's needs are. Takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then there has to be, sometimes that can't be done within the sibling group. Sometimes you need kind of outside authorities, like a medical authority, to provide a diagnosis that everyone can react to, but not just dismiss.
Right. Well, and is that the way to go forward? Because, sometimes parents don't want to even acknowledge that there is an issue. So then to try to get everybody at the same appointment to hear the same words, you don't know then how they hear. What's said and what is heard sometimes can be two totally different things. Is that the way forward, though, to do it that way?
So there are a number of steps here. So the first one is to try to get people on the same page to whatever degree is possible, knowing that not everyone is going to be in perfect agreement.
Right.
And so the first thing that you're alluding to is everybody needs access to the same information. So if one of the children goes to the medical appointment, for that person then to not just get on the phone and play, telephone,
Yep.
going from person to person, giving them a report, to send everybody the same write-up of the visit. A lot of times people will get a summary of the visit on the way out the door.
Right.
The parent was in the hospital to get the discharge summary, the problem list, the medication list. Everyone gets the same information via email, via text, and then for there to be some sort of forum where the siblings talk together to try to process what this information says, what it means, and what the implications are going to be over time. And sometimes it's helpful to have a primary care provider involved in those discussions, sometimes not. But for everyone to begin with some of the same information, what they do with that information is not going to be the same, but to start with the same medical information and then to do that on an ongoing basis. It's not usually a one-time event, especially with a slowly progressing disorder like dementia. So there's going to be multiple medical visits. Maybe there's multiple ER visits, maybe multiple hospitalizations. The more information accrues, and then it's harder for people to dismiss what the medical system is saying, and harder for them to dismiss what their siblings are saying. Everyone has to come to grips with what they're hearing, what they're seeing, and then do the responsible thing and begin to think about, well, what does mom need to live as well as she can for however long she has with this disabling condition.
Right. And that's part of the stress. Because if you are the primary caregiver and you're the one that's going to the appointments and, this one's working and that one's in a different state or whatever, and you come out of there with the information and you report that information, and then they go on as business as usual, or they want more information, or they go, okay, great, let me know how it works out. As the primary caregiver, we have to then balance all of that emotion and that disappointment and that resentment and go forward. And how is it that it's almost like you have to accept it, but you still have to push for it, but you have to accept it, but you have to say, okay, well, this is what's going on. Like, how many times do you go to that well after I've told you don't want to listen to what the report is, or you don't want to help? How many times do you keep going to that? And I know that's the $64,000 question. I know.
Yeah. So, I'll share a little bit of my experience, Roseanne, because
Sure.
I took care of my mom and stepfather. My stepfather had Alzheimer's disease. My mom had vascular dementia for about 7 years between the two of them.
Mm.
When in 2010, my wife and I decided to move them up from Florida, where they were living, to live in an apartment a mile from our house, up north here. Then my brother, who's in a different field than I am, he's not a psychologist and he doesn't work with caregivers.
Mm-hmm.
When I said to him, "This is what's going on. We're planning to move, mom and stepdad up. I really could use your help with whatever their needs are going to be going forward." His first reaction was, "Well, this is on you. You move them up.
Yeah.
This is your field of expertise. Good luck, buddy."
Wow.
Right?
Yep.
So,
Yep. It's your choice.
That didn't
Yeah.
that didn't go over well.
No.
um, and it took him, with my providing information for him, with him coming down and visiting him, seeing for himself what was going on. It probably took him a year to 2 years before he kind of got it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't happy with him during this year to year and a half, 2 years when he was absent,
Sure.
mostly absent. But I also understood that this was new territory for him. I was familiar with dementia because I had worked with individuals with dementia for my whole career.
Right.
I was familiar with the stresses of caregiving. I knew what it entailed. This was, for him, it was kind of brand new, and to get his head around it took a while. And that's not unusual, especially for something as sad as dementia. People don't want to get their head around it. They don't want to see mom declining or think that she's going to only get worse with time.
Right.
So caregivers in that situation, such as my situation or your situation, have to be patient. You have to kind of just wait for people to catch up, and they do. The problem is when caregivers are kind of holding down the fort, kind of waiting, they get very frustrated. And there may even be the temptation to lash out at a sibling, especially a sibling who maybe you have a previous history with where they haven't come through on other things.
Right.
But the lashing out doesn't tend to bring them closer. It's not like you forcefully drag them into caregiving. That doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time people dig their heels in and will hold their position and justify their position. So they have to kind of invite them in slowly and just provide increased evidence of what's going on. And that's all part of what I mentioned as step one. Step two is at a certain point when it's really time for everyone to make a commitment to contributing. What I do as a psychologist working with siblings in that situation is I basically say to everybody, sometimes as a group, sometimes individually, I say, it's time for everyone to contribute in some form or fashion. I don't think everyone's going to contribute equally because not everybody has the same ability to contribute equally or has the same availability.
Right.
But everyone has to contribute because you're not all just looking at what mom needs right now. You're all looking at one another and the decisions that you're each individually making. And people are not going to forget those decisions. And you have the opportunity now to strengthen your relationships with your siblings by really coming through for one another, or you have the opportunity to weaken and if not just destroy those relationships, because people will remember what the choices are and how people acted from now till forever, till mom may be dead 30 years and everyone will still remember.
Yeah.
And so I put it that starkly by way of saying, maybe you had a bad relationship with mom, you don't want to help mom, but if you had any kind of relationship, you care about having a relationship with your siblings going forward, what you do now matters. So the stakes are high. And usually that gets everybody's attention. Sometimes when I advise clients of taking that kind of position with their siblings, they get kind of squeamish. They don't want to ruffle people. But truthfully, that this is what it's about. I mean, it has to be placed that squarely before them for everyone to see, like, this is not business as usual. This is like something's happened. We have to step up because it matters now. It matters now to our parent. It matters now to our siblings. If we don't, then there's going to be a cost to that.
I think that's wonderful. I think everybody should hear that going forward, because you're right. You never forget what happened. You just don't. That's really great, Barry. That advice is so powerful because it can make the difference.
I mean, I will say, Roseanne, that having given advice like that for a long time, sometimes it makes a difference. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference. Sometimes there are siblings that even when it's placed in that high stakes context, they'll say, nope, I'm focusing on my own family. I'm focusing on my own career. You guys are, if you want to do this, it's up to you. I'll pay the cost of it. It means that we're not going to need to send Christmas cards to one another anymore. Okay, I'll do it. And that's extremely sad, because then for the other siblings, it's not just a loss of the parent eventually, but it's a loss of some of their sibling relationships they've had.
Yes. And what do you tell the people that are left with that rubble? What do you tell the people when that other sibling stands up and says, you know what, good luck to you, I'll see you? How does the caregiver that's caring deal with that?
It's usually very painful for them.
Mm-hmm.
And they feel betrayed. And they usually harken back to their relationship with that sibling and all the things they did for that sibling over time. And I basically say to them, this is the serenity prayer in action here. You got to accept the things you cannot change, and ultimately you'll have to make a decision whether you have any kind of relationship with that sibling again. But you're basically accepting that this person has limitations. They're making choices on the basis of those limitations. Do you accept them warts and all with those sorts of limitations, knowing that they may not have the same commitment to the parent or to the family of origin that you have?
Yeah,
I've seen clients over the years basically never have a relationship again with the sibling who let them down, and then I've had others who decide it's more important for me to have that relationship and forgive them, not to forget what they did, but to forgive them for what they did, because my family is that important to me, and I want to have some relationship with his brother, for instance, even if he was if he acted like a jerk.
right. Well, when you are caring together and you have the siblings that say, okay, I am gonna take part in this. How do you handle when you get micromanaged as a primary?
Okay, you're on to stage 3 here. So stage 3 is when the people who have committed to helping mom in some form or fashion have to now figure out how to work together, because you have siblings who may have squabbled all through childhood and then went off their separate ways. Maybe they got along pretty well in childhood, but they haven't really had to work together on anything for decades. And so now they're not children anymore. They're adults with different capabilities and maybe their personalities are different. Their own individual family situations are different. So they've got to learn to work together. And that has to be a very intentional process. So it means getting together and setting some ground rules, like how are we going to make decisions together? How are we going to share information together? How are we going to adjust the caregiving plan as our parents' condition changes or as our life circumstances change? I remember working with a caregiver years ago who was one of 10 siblings caring for a father who had a stroke, but then her own husband developed very significant cancer. And so she had to go to her 9 siblings and basically say, I really do want to help dad, but right at this time, I've got to turn my attention to my husband.
Right.
And everybody understood.
Wow.
Because there was a process in place there where people talked together. They had a level of trust to listen to one another. They all understood that everybody wanted to help, but there were things that occurred that may mean that for a time, one or another sibling is not able to help. And everybody got that. And in the end of the day, those were siblings who came out of caregiving with strong relationships, not weaker relationships. So what I recommend to sibling groups is that they have ongoing communication in writing, sharing medical documents, et cetera, in writing. So no one's going to mistake what was said. Everything is, it's not exactly legal, but everybody's, having in writing is helpful for developing a record. And that there needs to be a meeting every quarter at least. And at that meeting, you talk about, where is mom now? What does she need now? How do we provide that for her? Are we going to do it as we've always done it? Or are we going to change the plan a little bit, adjust it so different people are doing different things than they were in the previous quarter? And so all that creates a level of communication and cooperation. So to get back to your question about micromanaging, there are many instances where the primary caregiver feels like they understand things, they're on the line, they know what's best, and everyone should just kind of defer to them. And that rankles siblings who may have not liked that let's say this is the oldest sibling who was always kind of bossy, and now they're being bossy again. Well, I mean, that pushes lots of old buttons for people. And in those meetings, it would be very important to say, this is not just your parent, this is my parent. You're dictating in a way which feels like the way you used to tell me, when I was your little brother, you would boss me around. I don't want to be seen as your little brother anymore. I want to be seen as an equal partner in this, because I have the same degree of love and amount of commitment to caring for our parent. And so if the parent comes to my house for the weekend, I don't want you to be calling and checking that the parent has had their lunch or taken their pills when they're supposed to. But there's going to be a level of trust here where if I'm going to be a partner in this, that you trust me that I'm going to do the right thing. And if the right thing, in my idea of the right thing, isn't exactly the way that you do it, that's okay. because there's not just one way to do caregiving. There's lots of ways to do caregiving. So those are hard conversations, though, for sure.
They're very hard conversations. And what I'm hearing is what you've always done cannot continue to be how you communicate with each other going forward.
And I mean, people have to come to a place where they see each other as capable adults rather than, the whiny little brother or the bratty little brother or the bossy big sister or, all the ways we pigeonhole our siblings based on information we had about them, which is not relevant anymore.
But it's I think part of it is that it's so big, caregiving. It's so big and it's so important. And when you're looking at it every day, you're dealing with so many emotions. And then you have people that know where your buttons are, sometimes like to push them for sport. And, you're not as well rested as you should be or need to be. And all of that plays in. And sometimes it's like, being in a pinball machine bouncing around, and it's hard to try to get back to that stability of, okay, everybody, can we just talk about this? Can we just, as adults, talk about this and move forward with it? And there's always that friction that then comes up while you're trying to make this better. And I don't know how in the midst of all of this to make that a better process.
It's really hard, Roseanne. I mean, so two pieces of advice along those lines. So one is there's always processing content. So the content is what does mom need? Who's taking mom to the doctor this week? Right? Mm-hmm. Who's picking up her medications from the pharmacy? There's always specific things to decide. But the process is more, how do we make decisions together? How do we adjust what we do to help mom?
Right.
How do we make sure that she's as happy as she can be? And it's important for the conversations among siblings and not just be about who's doing what when, but also how are we doing? How are we doing working together? Are we being as kind and supportive of one another as we can be? Or, when we have friction, and inevitably we will,
mm-hmm.
How are we resolving the friction in such a way that people don't go away feeling resentful and that resentment builds up?
Yeah.
My expectation is that there's going to be disagreement, there's going to be friction, and that if people can work those things through, just like with any committed relationship, that they will come out the other side with stronger relationships and more trust than they ever had. And that matters. That's what we want. We don't want to lose our siblings in the process. We want to have, draw them closer to us, maybe appreciate them more as adults than we ever have, understand them better as adults than we ever have. So there is a potential for better sibling relationships in the long run. Unfortunately, that's probably the minority of the time. It's too many times one or another sibling relationship is damaged by what has gone on in caregiving.
Yes, I agree. There's also that part of it's almost like a holding hostage of care when we don't need to hire anybody to come in or we don't need anybody else. We can do it. But then when you ask for certain things to happen, those things don't happen. And then as the primary caregiver, you're I don't want to say stuck, but you're stuck. You're the one that's doing it. What do you do in those situations when time after time it's like, can you come or can you do this or can you pick this up and it doesn't happen?
You're only asking hard questions today, Trustee.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Well, let's see. I would probably, because I'm a little more confrontational than most people, I would probably say to my sibling, hey, you said you were going to do this and you didn't do it. I understand why, you say you didn't do it, but it's hard for me to rely on you if you don't come through, especially when there's a repeated pattern of this. And I, I don't want you to make promises that you can't keep. I would much rather know that you can't keep them beforehand, and then I'll make other arrangements. So commit to, if you make a commitment, you got to come through.
Okay.
Now, some people won't like that, right? Or some people become uncomfortable with that. But that's what I would say. You also raised, just reminded me that a lot of this is about money, unfortunately. So
Mhm.
mom has X amount of money. If we're spending all of mom's money on home health aides, then mom's money's going to run out, and that doesn't put mom in a good position. Or, there won't be any inheritance, right?
Mhm.
There won't be, all the things mom was going to had promised to give us one day. She won't be able to give us because she spent all the money for her own care,
Right.
or we've allowed her to spend all the money for her own care. So money, unfortunately, makes the emotions much more intense. And especially, I mean, I have seen situations where a parent is absolutely intent upon giving, and made their will public that everyone is going to get the same amount,
Mhm.
but all the expenses are coming out of one sibling's pocket,
Right.
and so there's a basic unfairness there. But the parent still has a control over, if they're cogent enough, still has control over where their money is used. So money makes all these sibling relationships more and more difficult.
Absolutely. Well, when is it okay to look outside of that to say, okay, fine, I accept that you are not going to do this. And I'm going to put this aside because a lot of time the anger and the back and forth is toxic to the caregiver because especially when you're an in-home situation and you look at everybody that's out, they're all living their lives and you're the one that's taking the brunt. And that it's hard, Barry, and there's a lot of resentment that builds up. And when is it that you have to say, okay, for my own health and my own well-being, I'm going to put this aside. I'm going to put this somewhere else. I'm going to let this go. When is that something that we can do as caregivers?
Absolutely. I mean, caregiving is hard enough. You don't need any more anguish. And so, especially if you feel like you're beating the head against the wall, if you're allowed to stop. Do you stop and basically say they're not ready? My siblings are not ready to help me. Hopefully, they'll be ready to help me later on. But I'm not going to beat my head against the wall now. I'm just going to continue to provide information for them, hoping that they'll come around. Or do you say this person's dead to me? I'm done with them. Either way, you're trying to protect yourself from getting hurt further. And I understand both of those things. The other thing I should mention is that sometimes siblings can't work this stuff out on their own. There's just too much emotion.
Right.
And not everybody has to come to a psychologist. Over the years, I've done a fair bit of what I would think of really as mediation among siblings, sometimes really angry siblings,
Mm-hmm.
to try to get everybody on the same page, to try to have them all make some sort of commitment, if not equal commitment, and to have them develop a process for greater cooperation moving forward. But this can be done by a trusted family friend. It could be done by a pastor or a priest. I mean, there's lots of different folks that can help with this. Because what happens is, I just talk about the work I do with siblings. When they're in my office, everybody's on their best behavior. People aren't screaming and yelling. And if they try to scream and yell, I'm going to say, stop screaming and yelling, right? This is not a place for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, when you lower the emotional temperature, people can hear each other better and be less reactive. And then there's a much better chance that they'll find a place of greater cooperation with one another. So having a referee, having a mediator is very helpful.
Yeah.
Just to get everybody to act more humanely toward one another.
I like that. Boundaries are hard in caregiving, no matter who you're caring for. And when you're caring for a parent in your house, in your home, and then your siblings are coming into your home, but feel like they're coming into their parents' home because they're living there and have no regard for your life, house, family, whatever. How can you establish any boundaries around that? Because it's kind of porous.
Yeah, I've heard this is not the first time I've heard this situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard. I mean, you would hope the siblings would come in and into your home and just like open the refrigerator and help themselves, right? Sit down and eat something that you were saving for yourself, right? What I've seen some families do is they'll have the parent have a kind of a room of their own, and that becomes the parent's domain to make decisions about. And then when other siblings come in, they feel a little freer in mom's domain rather than in the rest of the house. I've also seen where that doesn't happen, and where the primary caregiver, who's in whose home the parent is living, has to basically say, "Hey, when you come in our house, people take off their shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Please take off your shoes. I know you don't like to take off your shoes, but you're in our house and you have to take off your shoes. Or, you're welcome to take mom out and go, but if I'm responsible for giving her dinner and I'm not sure what time you guys are going to come back, that's inconsiderate. So, please let me know if I'm giving mom dinner or what time they'll be back so I can plan accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's again, it comes down to as much communication as you can have, as much cooperation as you could develop, and hopefully build trust. I mean, all those things are important. I have a client who I see nowadays who's, she has her mom who has dementia living in a kind of an in-law suite that's attached to her house. Her brother was just in for the holidays, and the brother came in with the family, and she was able to kind of corral them into mom's part of the house and preserve the part of her house where her husband and her children live. And I mean, certainly everyone saw one another, but it wasn't, brother didn't just come in and take over.
Right.
So it having that kind of space that provides not just a physical boundary, but can provide an emotional boundary.
And I was going to say, with holidays especially, it adds a whole nother level of stress, because then you're trying to coordinate everybody's schedules.
It is, and holidays are also very difficult because if there's been tension among the siblings or resentment, and now it's a holiday and everybody's supposed to be nice to one another, and maybe put on a happy face because that's what a parent wants.
Mm-hmm.
It makes the holidays doubly hard, and probably half as enjoyable as they might be. So those are all hard things. I recommend to people that they don't have some of these hard discussions during the holidays.
Right.
You don't wait to Thanksgiving dinner for everyone to kind of blast one another. That if there are conversations that have to happen, and should happen, that there's separate time for that.
Absolutely. Well, and you lead me right to my next question of what happens when you aren't getting along, or you haven't gotten along, or you just don't get along at this point, and your parent says, I don't want you all to fight. It's so nice to see you all together. How do you manage that? Because that happens more times than not, because as a parent, listen, you don't want your kids fighting. You want your kids to get along. You want to be all together. But how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I'll just share how I dealt with it, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I was very angry at my brother because he was not coming through. My mom knew I was angry at him, and my mom was in turn angry at me for being angry at him.
Right.
And I basically said to her, my relationship with my brother is up to me. I understand it's upsetting for you that your children are not getting along right now, but he and I have to work this out, and this is not something that you can dictate to us. And she didn't like that, but basically that's what I said.
Mm-hmm.
She was already feeling, she hated being dependent, and so she hated being dependent upon me. And then to think that she was the cause of conflict between her sons, and my brother and I had always been very close, made her feel guilty, and she didn't want to be made to feel guilty. Things were hard enough for her. So
Right.
For her sake, she wanted me to basically make it easier for her by not being angry with my brother, so she wouldn't have to worry about that. And I basically said, I hear you, Mom, and he and I will work it out, but it will take time, and I'm not going to just push this under the rug and make believe that we're not having some disagreement.
Right. That's a hard thing to do, Barry.
Yep. It was not. I mean, I'm not
Oof.
describing what I did as a kind of shining example of how to do this. It's just the way I did it.
Yeah.
And sometimes there are people who just opt to keep the peace,
Yeah,
for a parent's sake, and that's what works best for them, and that's fine. I mean, that's just not my personality, right? My personality is a little harder than that. So if my mother, let me see if I give another example. I mean, I have 3 first cousins, women who were very close to me, and their mother too had very bad dementia, my aunt, and they had major disagreements of the care that she was going to receive, but they also decided that for their mother's sake, they were going to defer to one another and put those disagreements aside. behind closed doors. They may vent them, but they weren't going to do that in front of their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And they managed to kind of keep up a good face in front of their mother and cooperate just enough with one another that they could pull in the same direction.
It's so hard in the sibling situation because it's almost this primal reaction that you have. And to try to stifle that, how are you stifling it? You're eating it away, you're drinking it away, you're smoking it away. I mean, there's such rage that goes with that because it's your very core, because these are the people that you've known your entire life. And as much as that, I mean, I love listen, Mom, we'll work it out. Don't worry about it. But then there's guilt that goes with that, unless you can let that go. Right. And then there's okay, I'm not going to think about it. Is there a healthy way for caregivers to try to sit with this, either accept where they are with their siblings or let it go and be okay with letting it go, but something that's not detrimental to our own health while we're doing all of this? Loaded question, I know.
These are great questions, actually.
Thank you.
They're making me think a lot. So in psychology, we do one of two things. We either help people change the situations that they're in that are difficult for them, or we help them react differently to those situations. So generally, we try to help people change the situation first. So when it comes to adult sibling groups who are involved in caregiving, we might work first on what are the ways of improving cooperation, communication, getting everybody to contribute more.
Mm-hmm.
And we may maximize that, right? But it's still very unequal and very dissatisfying. And then the question then becomes, well, if this is reality, then what do you do with reality?
Right.
And I understand those primal, those emotional feelings that come into play. I mean, they're very powerful. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, as my mother always used to say.
Yep.
And you have to accept the things you cannot change, as Renee Prairie says. So at a certain point, you just have to determine, okay, what am I going to do with how I'm feeling here? And what am I going to do about this relationship? So as we were talking before, do I continue to beat my head against the wall to try to change something that's not going to change? Or do I take a different tack and ultimately, I then have to decide what my relationship is with that person. I think acceptance is hard. Acceptance is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And to feel betrayed by a sibling is one of the hardest things in the world to accept. And in some ways, it's almost as painful, if not more painful, than watching a parent fade from dementia. I mean, and the two, it makes this kind of caregiving so much harder. It's bad enough to lose a parent. It's needless to lose a sibling in addition, and yet there are so many things we have to accept through this whole process, and that may be one of them. And how do we accept it and come to terms with it and not let it gnaw at us constantly?
Right, and that's the big question, and it's that acceptance. It's in the acceptance that the freedom is for us, and it's a matter of getting there.
Oh, for sure. And it's very, very hard, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't pretend that I accept well. I don't. There's a lot of sadness in caregiving, a lot of sadness in these situations.
Yes.
There's always a hope of better, right? There's always a hope of maybe you'll lose a parent, but you'll develop a new and better relationship with a sibling you ever had. And I try to hold on to those sort of hopes, but I also know that there's always a potential for greater loss, because we can't but help to have expectations in these situations, and our expectations are sometimes just going to be unfulfilled, which actually brings me to something else, which is I think people who are happiest are those whose expectations are kind of best tailored to the reality, and it's when our expectations and the reality are at a sync that people suffer. I mean, one thing I tell people right up front is that this is not going to be an equal opportunity endeavor here. There's going to be some people who do a lot of caregiving and others who are going to do very little, and that's just the way it is. And it doesn't make sense to chafe at that every day, because that's not normal. It's not normal to expect. So you don't want your expectations to be so high. You want them to be tailored to what the likely reality is going to be, as unfair as it seems,
Mm-hmm.
and try to, and that, I mean, that's the other thing. The expectation that this is going to be fair is just not realistic either. It's just not going to be.
Right.
So how do we accept unfairness, not necessarily swallow it? I mean, we may decide that we can't tolerate it, but not have a strong emotional reaction to it either. This is unfair. My brother is so wrapped up in himself and his life as he always has been. I'm not going to have a good relationship with him. That's the way it is. I can't change him. If I try to change him, he just gets his back up. All I can do is invite him into the caregiving team. If he doesn't choose to join us, I have the choice of not reaching out further or not having a relationship with him in the future. There's a lot of sadness in that, but better for me to do that than to feel steamed up about it all the time and then scream and yell at him every time I talk with him.
Because we're only hurting ourselves with that.
I think so.
Well, and it's one more thing to carry along the road. We get things all day that we're carrying as caregivers, right? We're carrying the managing of medications. We're carrying the being a psychologist to the people that we're caring for. I mean, there's 1,000 things that go with caregiving. And then those feelings that just sit with us. It's heavy and it weighs us down even more. And to be able to let that go is that peace. And I like what you were just saying about expectations. And the flip side of that is, yes, but I've given up my life to do this. I've given up pieces of my life, in my life, with my own family to do this. And when you're looking at your sibling who chooses to say, I'm going to concentrate on my family, and you're there saying, and this has become my life, how do you bridge that? How do you let that go?
Boy, you're really coming after me, aren't you? I mean, there isn't an easy answer. I have another client who's been living. Her mom has severe chronic pain, is basically bedbound, and her mom doesn't really want to get out of bed. She doesn't want to try to function at all. She wants to be catered to. Mm-hmm. My client and her family live with the mom, take care of her. There are 3 other siblings. Of the 3 others, one comes by regularly to help. The other 2 don't. The other 2 that don't basically say to her, when you moved in with mom to take care of her, you made this choice. We respect you for that choice, but it doesn't oblige us to make the same choice. Mm-hmm. That's really hard for my client to hear. In our work together, we've talked about exactly what we're talking about today. How do you accept diminished expectations of them? How do you, we talked about whether she wanted to have relationships with those 2 siblings or not, and she decided that she does want to have relationships with them. But she has to understand that she doesn't set the terms for those relationships. She can continue to invite them. She can continue to inform them. She can continue to hope that they come through, but not pin her sense of well-being on whether they come through or not.
Right.
I think with time, she's come to better accept, and in part by grieving that her expectations of these 2 siblings. It's interesting. The brother who's helping her is older than her, and then the 2 that are not helping her are younger than her. And she was the oldest daughter in the family, and she always took care of her younger siblings, who were, I think they're like 5 and 7 years younger than her. So there was a age gap. Mm-hmm. So she comes into this with this feeling of like, I took care of you. I looked out for you. I was there for you when you were a kid. You should be there for me now when I need this help.
Right.
But her siblings just don't look at it that way. And there's no way she can make them look at it that way. And so again, she's left with a choice. Do I accept them as they are, or do I not have a relationship with them? Right. And she's opted to accept them as they are. The paradoxical thing is that when she would push them really hard, they would stay away. Mm-hmm. When she stopped pushing them, they are more apt to come around.
Yep, I believe that.
So I'm feeling very sad as we're talking about this because it's
I know. I agree. It's because it's so hard and it's such a big piece of caregiving and it's such a big stressor. And we don't talk about it a lot because, people have this idea that, well, you just ask them to help and they'll come. And it's like, no, there's way more than this. There's more to this than that. And then when you're in it, you're trying to deal with it and you can't figure out how to get out of these patterns and these roles. And all the while you're caring for your parent who is deteriorating in front of you. I mean, we can't forget about that because that's all part of this as well. And then everybody's reaction to that, because nobody wants to acknowledge that, yes, this parent is in fact deteriorating and we're getting further down the road. And all of that adds together. And it's just this big emotional stew. And it's hard to, there isn't a magic wand of this. Well, if you do this, it'll fix this. It doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. There is good. I keep bringing up that there is good that could come out of it.
Yes.
And one of the other good things that could come out of this is that that the siblings can commiserate together and comfort one another while the parent is declining, and then after the parent dies, better than anybody can.
Right.
And that matters.
Yes.
And that matters a lot. And even if there's resentment about the way the caregiving proceeded, it's still a loss for everyone in the family. It's a shared loss and there's shared history there. And there's probably shared love for that parent. The love is not always exactly the same, but
right.
But people could stand together at the funeral or the memorial service or go to mass, say a mass for a parent. I mean, grieving together as a sibling group afterwards is really important, I believe.
When there's so much water under the bridge and you can't do that, it leaves you more isolated, I think. And then you have to find your way back again. And you still have to answer those questions of, do I want to have this relationship going forward, or do I not? And I would think, and I don't know, I mean, you would know this. How do you rebuild those relationships when caregiving ends?
If you decide that you want to rebuild the relationship, there's always choices. You have the choice of basically saying, well, let's let bygones be bygones.
Right.
Could make believe the last 5 years didn't happen and we could go back to where we were.
Mm-hmm.
I frankly think that's pretty unrealistic.
Yep.
So then it becomes a question of, do you have some open acknowledgement of the fact that there may have been a rupture in the relationship because of disagreement about how a parent was cared for? And do the siblings want to intentionally try to repair that rupture? So not, rather than make believe it doesn't exist, but basically say, we haven't had a nice conversation with one another in a long time. And that's not really what either of us wants. So how do we find a way together to work towards a better relationship? And I do think, frankly, that for the sibling that maybe hurt the primary caregiver, then it'd be important for them to, I'm not going to say express remorse, because they don't believe that they did anything wrong,
right?
But to acknowledge that the rupture in the relationship has existed, that they've contributed to that rupture, and that they take some responsibility for repairing that rupture. It's not all about, well, you've been throwing hissy fits now for years. When you stop throwing hissy fits, we'll be fine.
Right.
That's not realistic.
No. Okay. Well, I think I got you off track of what was number 4.
Number 4 was really actually what we're talking about now.
Okay.
And how at the end of the day do siblings grieve together and decide what the relationships are going to be? Okay. Because the relationships they're changed. They're not the same. And so they could then, and there is, I keep saying this, that there is a potential the relationships are better.
Well, Tom, talk to me about that a little bit, because that hurt is so deep, because it's almost like if you can't support me in caring for our parent, how do we get past that memory and that realization that, wow, if you can't do it then, how are you going to do it any other time?
So I think as hard as it is, because of how hurt we feel, I think we have to start with trying to turn toward our sibling with empathy, try to understand kind of who they are, why they made the choices that they made.
Yeah.
So again, let me refer to my situation with my brother.
Mm-hmm.
What was brewing, my stepfather's dementia, was really evident for a while before my wife and I moved them up from Florida. So it wasn't news. And my brother knew we were going to move them up. What happened, unfortunately, is probably 3 months, 4 months before we moved them up, his wife died suddenly of a burst aneurysm.
Oh, wow.
So he was grieving very severely.
Yeah.
So early on in my caring for my mom and my stepfather, I didn't ask him for anything because I knew he was hurting.
Sure.
After a year, I said, okay, bud, I gave you a year to grieve. I need you to do more. And that's when I got pushback from him. I felt justified at that point to have him do more, but he also felt that he wasn't ready, that he was still grieving.
Right.
For me to accept the choices that he made required me and still requires me to kind of try to understand what he was going through at that time, that he was not ready to give, that he was still hurting. And that's, what I just described is a kind of extreme situation. Not every sibling situation is going to happen like that, but people are not completely irrational. They make the choices that they make for reasons. So what are the reasons? Even if they're not reasons we agree with. A very typical reason is they have a spouse who doesn't like the family or who's very covetous of the person's time.
Mm-hmm.
And for the good of maintaining a relationship with that spouse, they can't give as freely as they might to their family of origin or to the parent.
Right.
That's really hard because then that, but for the primary caregiver to have empathy that the sibling who's not coming through is in a bind. They don't want to sacrifice their relationship, and that they really can't find an easy balance. So there are extenuating emotional, relational circumstances that we have to take into account as a way of trying to find our way to empathy and greater acceptance and understanding.
So it's expectation, it's understanding, it's letting go of what you can't control, and empathy.
Man, it sounds like all hard things. All things that we're all taught.
Right.
It's all about love.
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what it is.
Yeah. But none of it's easy.
No.
Especially when we're already in pain, when we're already tired, when we're already feeling that we lost control of our own lives. It's so hard.
Can I ask how your relationship with your brother is now?
So my mom died in April of 2017.
I'm sorry.
So we had some time to recover.
Mm-hmm.
It's better, but it's not nearly as close as it was prior to my mom and stepfather getting ill. So I think slowly, and I would say gradually, we're working our way back. So we have a relationship, but it's not ideal for either of us.
Okay. Takes time.
Takes time, takes effort, like anything else.
Mm-hmm.
My brother and I live in different parts of the country, which makes it harder.
Sure.
So it would mean making a very concerted effort to repairing some of this.
Mm-hmm.
When we see each other, we make that effort. When we talk on the phone, we make that effort, but we probably don't do it as often as we need to. I think about it a lot, because it does represent another loss.
Yes.
So,
well, as a psychologist, as a former caregiver, going forward, for anyone who's listening, what would your advice be? Is it to have a therapist? Is it to have an outlet for these feelings, or to have a mediator? What would the best thing when you're dealing with your siblings in caregiving be?
As much as I'd love everyone to be in therapy, not everybody needs to do that or wants to do that. or can afford to do that.
Mhm.
I think, I mean, to put it as simply as possible, Roseanne, I think for people to be kind to themselves and to be kind and understanding the best of their abilities with their siblings, knowing that no group of siblings is going to do this right off the bat, that it's going to evolve over time, there's going to be struggling, that all that is normal, that it's never going to be completely fair or equal, but that at the end of the day, the stakes are high. You know, you're losing your parent. What do you do? What can you do within your power to 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 bring your siblings closer to you if that's what you want? So I don't have. I mean, all of that, as we've unpacked in the last hour, is a lot more complicated than what I just said. Because and as you have brought up a number of times, because of the emotions run high.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge that is worth thinking about. It's worth not just reacting to one's siblings, but really thinking about, okay, who is this person? Why are they choosing what they're choosing? What kind of relationship do I want to have with them? How can I not allow the past relationship to dictate how we're going to relate to one another now? How can we meet on a new ground as adults rather than as maybe contentious children? We're not contentious children anymore.
A big thank you to Barry Jacobs for being my guest today. To find out more about Barry, check out his website, loveandmeaning.com. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today. Head over to daughterhood.org and click on the podcast section for show notes, including the full transcript and links to any resources and information from today's episode. You can find and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to your podcasts. We are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Daughterhood the Podcast and daughterhoodthepodcast.com. Feel free to leave me a message and let me know what issues you may be facing and would like to hear more about. Or even if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. Also, a very special thank you to Susan Rowe for our theme music, the instrumental version of her beautiful song Mama's Eyes from her album Lessons in Love. I hope you found what you were looking for today: information, inspiration, or even just a little company. This is Roseanne Corcoran. I hope you'll join me next time in Daughterhood.